Welcome, friends, neighbors, and students to this lecture on the American Revolution. You may be wondering why you can't see my face at the moment. This is in part because I've done something with my video camera, which I'm not sure how to fix. So we will rely on my avatar instead to represent me there in the far right corner. Uh, However, although you cannot see me, what you can see in front of you is a question. Why? Today's lecture will explore why the American Revolution took place and what caused it. I'm going to give you three reasons as to why the American Revolution took place. Uh, Remember that for more than 150 years, the British American colonists had settled along the east coast of North America. They weren't the only Europeans to land on the shores of the Americas. The French, the Dutch had landed in North America too, and the Spanish had carved out for themselves a vast empire across North America, South America, in Central America, today Mexico, more than 100 years, even before the first English settlers set foot in North America. But by the 1760s, the British had carved out an empire for themselves across much of North America. And at the heart of it was the 13 colonies that you can see there in dark red. For more than 150 years, these colonies had grown. Yet by 1763, at the end of an imperial war versus the French, the British no longer ruled simply the 13 colonies, but they had acquired territory across much of North America, including Canada. And for the colonists, this seemed like a great opportunity. With the expansion of the British Empire, it seemed like they would be able to claim more territory, settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains, that were often the natural boundaries of these 13 colonies, go beyond the Appalachian Mountains, deep into the interior of North America, and expand their colonies as well too. The British had a different view, and this is what's going to in part serve as a dispute between the colonists and the British government. The British government, in particular Parliament, again, even though these 13 colonies are part of the British Empire and it's ruled in part by the crown, by the royal family of Great Britain, King George III. It's really the representative body, Parliament, by the 1760s that really rules over the British Empire. And in Parliament, there's a House of Commons where the commoners are represented, a House of Lords where the lords are represented. And in the 1760s, this time the British Empire, it's really the nobility, the 500 families from the House of Lords that really run the British Empire by and large as they see fit. Again, certainly the King George III, has a say in how the empire is run. But in practice, it is really Parliament, the 500 families, and most importantly, the British Prime Minister that decides the governance of the empire. And the British Prime Minister, British Parliament, has decided that rather than allowing these 13 colonies to expand further westward, they would instead prefer to see them confined to the coastlines. And in fact, much of this new British territory will be left as an Indian reserve to allow the American Indians to continue to live as they have lived. And Canada, newly acquired by the British Empire, will be given much of this territory. The province of Quebec, that you can see there in pink, being given the Great Lakes territory. This is much to the discouragement of the 13 colonists. They certainly see themselves as British, but as British Americans, as part of the British Empire, as equal subjects under the British Crown entitled to the rights of Englishmen, and they're quite discouraged with being disallowed from settling farther westward. Not only that, after the 7 Years' War, what the American colonists here call the 7 Years' War, the British decide that they are going to take a more direct role in governing these 13 colonies through what's called the Quartering Act. They begin to permanently station regular British troops in the 13 colonies. For the first 150 years of these colonies, the colonists had been left to fend for themselves. They formed their own militias, provided their own protection. But now, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government has decided that they're going to take a direct hand in providing protection to the colonists, in part from the American Indians. But interestingly, the British government decides to station many of their troops not on the frontiers, but instead in the cities of the colonies themselves. This is going to create a bit of tension between the colonists and the British Army, as you can see there in the painting on the right. Not only that, to help fund this new military occupation, the British are going to raise taxation. This is I would argue, the second reason why the American Revolution takes place. It's not only just simply a dispute over land. Again, the colonists seeking to spread westward, the British government seeking to keep them confined to the coastline with a proclamation line of 1763, but also taxation. To fund their imperial wars, the British government will often go into debt. This is what governments do when they're strapped for cash and need to fight for their lives. And at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government has accrued a great deal of debt, not just simply to financial institutions like banks, but to many of the members of the 500 families, so the nobles that run the British Empire. And for those that have loaned money to the British government, they would like to see it paid back. Unfortunately, to pay back debts, you have to raise money, often through taxation. And the British government reasons that not only was the 7 Years' War intended to help expand the empire, but to protect those 13 colonies. So perhaps the colonists should take a greater degree in helping pay for maintaining the British Empire. The colonists pay very little tax directly to the government in London. Most of their taxes just go to their local representative governments. Even though Parliament runs the British Empire and we have the king in England, the colonies themselves have their own representative bodies that by and large manage their day-to-day affairs. Again, this is in many ways mini parliaments, these colonial assemblies. Again, their conception is even as they come across the Atlantic Ocean, these English settlers bring with them the belief that not only that they are British, but also that they're entitled to the rights of Englishmen, the rights of Britons, as have been practiced in their historical homeland. It might be a surprise as well, too, to learn that the 13 colonies are not the most lucrative part of the British Empire. In fact, the British have established colonies all across the world by the 1760s, in Asia, along the African coast, but its most lucrative, most profitable colonies are in the Caribbean. Those small Caribbean islands, with their slave plantations, grow cash crops like sugar and coffee that sell for a fortune on the global market. And compared to the taxes raised in North America, it's Caribbean colonies that are more valuable to the British. And compared to British taxpayers in England, the American colonists too pay relatively little tax. You can see the cartoon there on the right, a representation from the 19th century of a British tax collector coming to someone's home and talking about taxes, taxes, taxes. Again, so relatively speaking, the American colonists pay little in taxes compared to their counterparts in other parts of the British Empire. Yet, with the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government has realized that these 13 colonies are seemingly not paying their fair share, and they are going to do take various methods in which they're going to, by how they're going to raise taxes to see the colonists ultimately increase their pay to the imperial coffers. So you can see this cartoon here of those British officials turning their eyes towards the 13 colonies, looking perhaps expectantly to raise the taxes on them. One way the British plan to do this is through something called the Navigation Acts. These are old laws that have been on the books for some time that the Americans, by and large, have been ignoring. This little cartoon here will perhaps help you see a representation of the Navigation Acts in practice. Even though ideas like free trade are starting to emerge in the British Empire and the English speaking world, at the same time, officially, mercantilism, the idea that the wealth of the British Empire should remain within the British Empire, that there should be higher exports than imports, that the purpose of an empire is to acquire bullion. This is perhaps a zero sum game of world economics, that you have to acquire as much territory, acquire as much wealth as possible, so that you have the biggest pile of gold, of bullion, so as to manage world affairs. This is the approach of the Navigation Acts, again, that goods should be produced by Britons, and particularly the colonies should provide raw materials to the mother country, England, that you can see there on this cartoon, which will then produce finished products, sell them on the global market, acquire more gold. The purpose of colonies is to provide raw materials, is to be a appendage of the larger imperial project. They're not to be independent economies in their own right, but rather dependent upon British trade, dependent upon British ships, dependent upon British finished goods as part of a larger imperial project. That being said, in practice, although this cartoon shows you how the British would like perhaps trade to be managed in their empire, in actuality, the colonists pretty much do as they wish, trading with who they want, often avoiding taxes. And for the British, again, with this great national debt, having to pay off this war debt, which was in part to help protect the 13 colonies, they are now looking for the colonists to now pay up and to perhaps do so through the Navigation Acts. A revision of the Navigation Acts is the Sugar Act. This is a tax on sugar and tea. Again, remember, guys, against those Caribbean colonies that are most valuable in the British Empire. And interestingly, what the British plan to do is to lower the tax. They're going to lower the actual tax on the books. And they're also going to start to enforce the law itself. Again, this free trade smuggling that the colonists are engaging in have been widespread for years upon years. But now the British are going to enforce it. For the first time in decades, the British are going to seriously enforce these customs on products moving through the colonies and from foreign colonies as well too. And they are going to rely on custom officials to enforce them. This is not to the liking of the colonists, and to see that these laws are enforced, when the British will capture smugglers, they won't send them to civilian courts, to local courts in the 13 colonies. Instead, if these smugglers are caught on the high seas, the British government is going to assert that they should be tried in naval courts, in what are called vice admiralty courts, military courts, and that they shouldn't be perhaps tried in the 13 colonies, but on an island off the coast of Canada, Nova Scotia, to prevent them perhaps being acquitted by their neighbors who are sympathetic to their smuggling. So again, guys, just as a brief review, the colonists and the British are having a dispute over taxation. They're having a dispute over taxation, or perhaps I should say the British government and the colonists are having a dispute over taxation, by which the British government is trying to raise revenue through things like the Sugar Act, again, enforcing laws that have been on the books for some time. And the colonists, in response to this, challenge these laws in the courts. Oftentimes, when trying to catch these smugglers, the British will arrest, impound, and search ships looking for smuggled goods, looking for goods that have not paid their taxes, and will not issue a right of assistance. This is a search warrant. To the colonists, this is quite upsetting. It's true, when actually the British are enforcing these taxes, they actually gain very little revenue from them. Certainly not enough to pay the great debt that they've acquired from their wars. Yet what they do gain a lot of are litigations, are lawsuits that the colonists will do to challenge the British in enforcing these laws against smugglers. And this is a bit of a back and forth between the colonists and the British government. So when first challenging the British government, the colonists go for the courts. They argue that the most essential rights of Britons, their basic rights as Englishmen, as parts of the British Empire, are being violated because they are not being given the proper warrants to search their property, that these British subjects under the British Empire are not having their principal rights respected by the British government. This is creating tension between the colonists and government. Yet, despite the tension, the British decide that they are going to pass another law, the Stamp Act. This is a tax on all paper goods, and you can see a representation of Parliament there on the right side of the screen. Actually, a painting of Parliament at the time in the late 1700s, the British Parliament. And this Stamp Act is a tax. It is a tax on all paper goods, on documents, newspapers, licenses, playing cards. And although it's passed by Parliament, again, the governing body of the entire British Empire, for the colonists in the 13 colonies, they are quite opposed to it. Why? Because it is an internal tax. Even though Parliament is a representative body and governs the entire British Empire, none of those members of Parliament are from the 13 colonies. Again, the 13 colonies have their own colonial assemblies, their own representative bodies that govern the 13 colonies, and they don't have representation in Parliament. And so when Parliament passes this tax on all paper goods across 13 colonies, the colonists are outraged. In particular, people like businessmen and lawyers, people who use a lot of paper in the late 1700s, they are quite annoyed with this Stamp Act and oppose it furiously. And they're not going to just simply challenge it in the courts, but they are going to protest publicly. You can see these colonists there on the right, ultimately gathering up paper goods and burning them there in the town square. They're going to form organizations like the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts. They're also going to create across 13 colonies what are dubbed committees of correspondence, groups in which ultimately these colonists are going to form, in which they're going to write to each other, but also gather together their objections to this new Stamp Act, this new tax on paper goods. And you can see these two colonists there at the forefront of the painting, sort of talking amongst themselves as they're perhaps writing to their friends farther away. The cry that the colonists take up is no taxation without representation. Their argument is if British Parliament wishes to tax them, well, the British Parliament should give them representation, should allow representatives from the 13 colonies to sit in Parliament. That doesn't take place, and the colonists will continue to protest and sometimes often threaten British custom officials that, again, are trying to tax these trade goods, catch these smugglers, intimidate also as well to British tax collectors, again, who are going to issue the taxes on these paper goods. Intimidation is something that these American colonists are not above doing. You can see this British official there at the center of the painting being surrounded by this crowd. You can see sort of these despondent British soldiers there in the background, seemingly helpless to do anything to maintain law and order. Because there is popular resistance across much of the 13 colonies against what they see as unjust laws. And if you aren't going to take message, the colonists might even drive you out of town as well too. You can see these British officials fleeing with their one's wigs flying there in the air. In fact, the governor of Massachusetts, who is a staunch supporter of the British government, actually has his house ransacked by belligerent members of the Sons of Liberties that are opposed to what they see as these unjust taxes, this unjust government of the being ruled above them. It's not just simply protests in the streets, though. Again, these colonists have their own representative bodies, and in the Virginia Assembly, they pass a series of resolves, of resolutions, declaring their Virginian resolves, stating that the taxation of the people by themselves or by people chosen by themselves to represent them is the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom. Again, in the minds of these British American colonists, they see themselves as British, as Englishmen, just as those that are across the Atlantic Ocean, and they feel their rights are being violated by Parliament by passing taxes on them without giving them representation in Parliament simultaneously. Ultimately, the British government is going to back down. It's going to repeal the Stamp Act. You can see this little cartoon here. where these sad members of parliament are taking that little coffin, which represents the Stamp Act, to its early grave. But still, the British government needs taxes. It needs to pay off that debt that it's acquired. And Parliament as well, too, even though it rescinds, pulls back or repeals the Stamp Act, it still asserts its right to pass with full power and authority to make laws and statutes over all members of the 13 colonies. And this is the crux of the issue about why the American Revolution is going to take place. It's a question of representation. Although there are disputes over land and disputes over taxation, it really is the question of representation that's going to bring this dispute between the colonists and between the British government to ultimately a conflict and to a force of arms. The British are going to pass more taxes, what are called the Thompson Acts. For many of the colonists, they reason that perhaps the British have a right to tax goods that are across the empire, but they don't have the right to pass taxes directly over the 13 colonies. And so the new British government, through the Thompson Acts, decides to place a tax on imported goods, things like glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea, goods, that exports that are brought from other parts of the empire, from across the world to the 13 colonies. And rather than being a direct tax, this is a duty tax. Goods that are being imported into the colonies, perhaps the colonists won't have an objection to legally. But unfortunately for the British government, the Americans continue to protest. They see this as taxation by other means. The intent of Parliament is still there, to gather taxes from them without representation. And these new taxes are objected to so fiercely. In fact, the British government decides to suspend some of the local representative bodies at the same time as well, too. British troops are being quartered in major cities across the 13 colonies. And this is leading to, again, more and more tension between the colonists and between the British government. This time, the colonists are going to respond with boycott. Again, they have challenged these laws in the courts. They have formed protest movements, organized themselves across the 13 colonies. But this time, in response to these taxes on goods that are being imported into the 13 colonies, the colonists are going to refuse to buy them. They're going to boycott them. Instead, they're going to try to produce their own goods rather than pay for these goods, which they see as having an unjust tax on them. In response, the British government initially suspends many of the local representative governments, the colonial assemblies across 13 colonies. But this dispute goes on for 3 years. It's now been close to 6 years since the first tax was passed. The Sugar Act was passed against these 13 colonies. So this is a long dispute between the colonists and between the British government. And in the end, after 3 years of boycott, the British government again decides to back down. It backed down with the Stamp Act. It's now backed down with many of the Thompson Acts. However, the British government decides to leave one tax in place. It's a symbolic tax. This is no longer about trying to raise money to pay off that debt that the British government is in. No, the British government decides to leave one symbolic tax still on tea, again, to signal that Parliament has the right to tax and govern the colonies as it sees fit. However, the colonists have a different perspective. With tensions still present, even though these taxes have been rescinded, there's going to be a confrontation between British troops and members of and local Boston residents in what's dubbed the Boston Massacre. One evening, there is a young British soldier, sentry, outside the military barracks, standing on guard. He begins to be harangued by a crowd of the local Bostonites, and when he can take it no more, he runs back to the barracks and calls out his fellow soldiers. When the entire array of British soldiers comes out, more colonists gather. They begin to throw snowballs. Then they begin to throw rocks and oyster shells at the British. And in the midst of the confusion, ultimately the British opened fire. They opened fire on the crowd in what's dubbed the Boston Massacre. Even though the British soldiers are perhaps not are acquitted, are not found at fault for opening fire, to the colonists, this is seen as British tyranny once more. You can see this cartoon representing what the colonists dubbed the Boston Massacre, a little bit different from the reality of what took place, but nevertheless, the idea of an oppressive government is still there and fresh in the colonists' minds after news of the confrontation in Boston spreads across the 13 colonies. For 2 years, though, after the Boston Massacre, there was relative peace across the colonies. Yet that symbolic tax on tea still remains. You can see a colonial portrait there of a British American family enjoying tea. It's a habit that the American colonists have adopted like their English cousins. Yet in 1773, the British government decides to send ships from the East India Company to many of the ports across the 13 colonies. The tea itself is cheap, cheaper than you would buy in England, but that symbolic tax on it still remains. And so in port after port, in Charleston and Philadelphia, the ships are turned back. But in one port, in the port of Boston, the British governor, Hutchinson, insists that the colonists should pay for the tax that is placed on the tea, and the tea should be brought ashore. The members of the local Sons of Liberty disagree. They decide ultimately one evening to sail out to Boston Harbor to board the tea ships, to find the tea in the cargo hatches, to grab those boxes of tea and dump them into the harbor. With no tea, or with the tea floating in the harbor, no one can pay the tax on it. When the American colonists, when the members of the Sons of Liberty do this, they dress up as Indians and ultimately sail back into Boston. And when the British officials come to try and figure out and arrest who destroyed all this tea, the Bostonites shrug their shoulders and say, well, it wasn't us, it was the Indians that did it. This fools no one, of course. But nevertheless, with news of the destruction of the East India Company's tea reaching London, which the colonists dubbed the Boston Tea Party, the British government is outraged. They, in their minds, had been entirely reasonable. They had backed down with the Stamp Act. They had backed down with the Thompson Acts. And now these colonists have taken it a step further with the destruction of property. And they have decided that rather than relying on goodwill, they are going to rely now on force. You can see these cartoons here as well, giving different representations of the Boston Tea Party. There on the right, you can see those ruffian colonists forcing a British official who's been tarred and feathered, ultimately to drink tea, and the tea being poured into Boston Harbor. You can see another cartoon there on the right, which represents 13 colonies being held down by the British government, by the courts, a British official pouring tea down a representation of the 13 colonies, Lady Liberty sort of looking away in shame, and in the far right corner, the other countries of Europe watching with interest as the British army as well too there sort of stands of a sword, forcing the colonists to accept British rule. After the Boston Tea Party, the British government passes what are called the coercive acts, or what the colonists dubbed the intolerable acts. They ultimately declare that Boston is going to be under martial law. In fact, the entire colony of Massachusetts is going to have its charter revoked. It will now be under direct control of Parliament. at least until the tea is paid for. Not only that, Boston is going to become a major garrison town. Thousands of British soldiers flood the streets of the towns of Boston, effectively putting it under military occupation until the tea is paid for. The British government is going to rely on force to compel the colonists of Massachusetts to pay for it. When the other 12 colonies hear news that Massachusetts has had its right to self-govern itself revoked, that it's being governed directly by Parliament, and that's been, in effect, been placed under military occupation, there is great sympathy. In fact, members of the 13 colonies get together and form a Congress, a gathering. In the largest city of the 13 colonies, in Philadelphia, they gather together with representatives from all the 13 colonies, building upon their networks that they had before, protesting British taxation and laws. And they declared that they are going to boycott all British goods in support of Massachusetts. They are going to buy nothing from the British government until ultimately the British government returns to Massachusetts its rights of self-government, ends its military occupation, and they insist that they are still loyal British subjects. Again, they are only asking for what they see as their rights as Englishmen, as members of the British Empire. They see themselves as entitled to principles of self-governance long established by the English, and continue to hope to enjoy them under the British as well too. But now that there is this dispute between Parliament and the colonists are refusing to buy any British goods. Again, they've launched a boycott on all trade. Yet even as the 13 colonies are organizing themselves into a protest movement, in effect, creating their own government, many of these colonial assemblies have been suspended by the British government in response to the Continental Congress. In Massachusetts itself, though, in the countryside, many of these colonists begin to form militias. They have defended their rights for generations, often from attacks from the French and Indians, and now they begin to form militias to defend their rights from what they see as the threats of the British government. For the British Army in Boston, this is a bit of dilemma as they hear news of militias gathering in the countryside, acquiring arms, acquiring ammunitions, shot and gunpowder. And the British commander in Boston hears news that the Americans have stored ammunition, have ultimately stored ammunition and powder in the town of Concord. And they decide that they are going to go on an expedition, find these arms, find this ammunition, destroy it, and then return back to Boston. Again, perhaps that might, at least it might, if it comes to a contest of arms, at least prevent the Americans from arming themselves so much. When ultimately news of this British expedition becomes known into the town of Boston, one of its residents, Paul Revere, is going to ride out in the night and warn the militias in the countryside that the regulars are coming. The regular British army is coming out to the countryside, ultimately to seize these weapons and gunpowder, or at least they hope to. As the British march out towards Concord, though, they are confronted by a group of militiamen who've dubbed themselves Minutemen because they claim that they can assemble themselves in less than a minute to form a common militia. These British regular soldiers are confronted in the greens of Lexington with a group of militia Minutemen. One of the British officers rides out, orders that the militia disperse, that it leave the green, and ultimately allow the British Army to continue to head towards Concord. But the militiamen don't. They don't say anything. They remain standing, and then a shot rings out. It's not sure who fired that first shot, but when it rings out, ultimately the British open fire. The militia scatter. Several of their members have been killed and wounded. And the British keep marching towards Concord. Again, they're not hanging around in Lexington to try and hunt down these members of this militia. Again, they're headed towards Concord to find that stash of ammunition and gunpowder, destroy it, and then head back into Boston. They arrive at Concord. They find very little, destroy what they do find, and start to march back towards Boston. Unfortunately for the British Army, though, in the meantime, thousands of these militia Minutemen have gathered on all the roads leading back to Boston. News of the Battle of Lexington has spread across the countryside of Massachusetts like wildfire. And now thousands of these militiamen have picked up their arms, set themselves in positions on all the roads leading back to Boston, and they're going to ambush the British Army time and time again. It leads into a running fight between the British Army and these American militia. And ultimately, the British Army is forced to retreat back into Boston after suffering heavy casualties. So the first shots of the American Revolution have rung out. This dispute over taxation, over representation, has now become a contest of arms between the Massachusetts militia and the British Army. The Continental Congress had decided to boycott all British goods, but they're not meeting every single day. In fact, they had met several months before. They had met several months in 1774, or I should say, during the in response to the Coercive Acts. And when they re-meet in May of 1775, they are quite aghast to learn about how the conflict has escalated. The British government decides to send reinforcements to Boston to support the British military that's confident that it can ultimately defeat what they say is these rebels, these rogue militias that have attacked them. And the Massachusetts militias have seized many of the hills surrounding Boston, but the British regular army is confident they're professional soldiers, that they can handle these militias that are just ragtag bands of men as far as they're concerned. And they decide they're going to storm one of these major hills outside of Boston called Bunker Hill. When they do so, it leads to a bloody mess. The British are successful in storming the hill, driving the militia off Bunker Hill, but at a terrible price. It's a bloody battle. The British suffer heavy casualties, and in response to it as well, too. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress decides to form an army comprised not just simply of the militia of Massachusetts, but of an army with militia from all 13 colonies, ultimately to resist what they see now as this British tyranny. It's not just simply Massachusetts that will fight, but all its sister colonies have decided to support it in its struggle against the British, and ultimately to rise up in rebellion by what they see as the unjust governance by the British government. To lead this Continental Army, the colonists have appointed a former British officer, his name is George Washington, a Virginian, to lead this army against the British. Even as the conflict is escalating, though, and George Washington will lead this Continental Army to Boston, in which the British will peacefully withdraw from Boston, again, now being surrounded not just simply by militias, but now by an organized Continental Army. They decide to withdraw from Boston. Yet even as this conflict is growing, the Continental Congress decides to send a petition, a request for negotiations between Parliament and the Continental Congress, in which they send it actually to King George III, to the king, to act as perhaps a mediator between Parliament and the Continental Congress, asking that he may graciously interpose to procure us relief from our afflicting fears and jealousies occasioned by the system before mentioned, and to settle peace through every part of our dominions. At the same time, the colonists still declare that they have a right to rise up in rebellion and to fight what they see as an unjust government, but they're also looking to negotiate simultaneously. For more than a year and a half, the battle goes back and forth between the British government and the American colonists. And there are several things that are interesting here that I can mention. But first is that for these British American colonists, they are fighting for what they see as their rights and liberties. They are not fighting for independence, at least not yet. In the first year and a half, they are fighting for their rights and liberties. They still want to be part of the British Empire. They see themselves as British, but nevertheless, they see themselves as maltreated by the British government and therefore have a right to fight for their rights. But by the spring of 1776, things are going to change. The American colonists had tried to bring Canada into their rebellion by sending an expeditionary force northward into Canada. It failed. But despite its failure, the Americans achieved a series of military victories. Yes, they forced the British to withdraw from Boston, even though it's without a fight. They also, when the British tried to seize control of Charleston, the major city of South Carolina, they're driven off by the Charleston militia. This is seemingly military victories that are putting confidence in the minds of the colonists. Second is there's a great change in public mood. Thomas Paine is a great supporter of this American rebellion, of the Continental Congress, of these Americans asserting their rights. He's actually an Englishman, an immigrant who, again, perhaps born in England, but sees himself now fully American, having lived in the colonies. And in the spring of 1776, he's going to publish a pamphlet called Common Sense. And this pamphlet makes two major claims. Number one, it claims that the colonists should not be just simply fighting for their rights and liberties, but they should be fighting for their independence, that they should separate off and form their own nation, separate from the British Empire. And second, that this new American nation should be a democratic republic. It should not be ruled as an empire. It should not have a royal family. And if it's going to have a representative body, there should be perhaps as much participation as possible by the citizens of that republic to determine their representatives. This is a quotation here from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, in which he particularly ridicules the idea of monarchy. While many of the American colonists saw themselves as having a dispute with Parliament, they did not see this dispute so much with King George III. Yet Thomas Paine's Common Sense is going to really attack monarchy as an idea and also attack King George III himself, which is going to sway public opinion. So it's not just simply that these American colonists are seemingly winning victories on the battlefield, but also, too, that there's a change in public opinion by the summer of 1776. Third and finally is by the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress has received a reply from the British government, from the king, to their olive branch petition to negotiate and try and find some peaceful solution now that fighting's broken out between the British government and the American colonists. And the king refuses to even read the olive branch petition. He declares all the members of the Continental Congress, again, from all members of these 13 colonies, that they are traitors, and traitors guilty of treason should only be dealt with one way. They should be hung. This is perhaps disappointing to those members of the Continental Congress who wanted to negotiate, but for others, it seemingly gives them a stronger resolve. And so in the summer of 1776, three members of this Continental Congress are given the job to draft up a Declaration of Independence. They represent different parts of these 13 colonies. We have Thomas Jefferson, the primary author, from the oldest colony, Virginia, again, from a landed, wealthy family. We have John Adams from Massachusetts, a lawyer, who represents perhaps the first shots fired during the revolutions, coming from those rather feisty Massachusetts men. And third and finally, we have Benjamin Franklin. The Continental Congress is meeting in the largest city of the colonies at the time, Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. And Benjamin Franklin is a well-known resident of Philadelphia. and is going to write with these two other men this Declaration of Independence that will declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And on July 4th, 1776, that is exactly what the Continental Congress declares itself to be an independent republic separate from the British Empire, and that they are no longer just simply fighting for their rights and liberties, but they are fighting now to become an independent nation. That story, I hope, we can explore a little bit more as we go forward in our course.